Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and today we got another solo album review. The newest project from Jessie Ware, That Feels Good. So one of the most exasperating feelings as a critic is when there's a project that's critically acclaimed, it's getting a lot of groundswell, maybe even the public is getting on board, and you're just kind of lukewarm on it. Not negative, not hostile, it just does not click with you as deeply or as strongly. It's even worse if you know how it's supposed to make you feel, and you want to feel it, but either through some quirk of the writing, or the production, or just tonal choices, it doesn't have that deeper resonance. And here's the secret truth. It's worst of all when it's pop music, especially the stuff for the dance floor, because that's often built for universality, bringing in the largest possible audience. And not only do you feel like the killjoy for not really connecting to it, you wind up becoming the wallflower, and the perks thereof aren't quite as satisfying as some longing crooners will actually make them out to be. Now, to be slightly fair to myself, 2020 was kind of an outlier all around. A remarkably strong year for pop, both mainstream and indie, with the absence of dance floors. There was plenty of stuff that connected for me that year, and if one or two albums didn't work, I'd have plenty more that would. But I gotta admit, it did sting. With the more listens that I gave Jessie Ware's What's Your Pleasure, the more I was sure that it wasn't clicking for me. It was a step away from the sophistopop that I mostly liked, but didn't really care about from her much in the 2010s. She went straight for throwback disco from the late 70s and the early 80s, and she had that rich voice and superb production to back it up to a point. When she stuck with the 70s disco with the more supple grooves and arranged orchestration, yeah, I got it. I was entirely on board. But that was only about a third to half of the album, with the rest leaning on the sharper, stiffer, more synth-heavy 80s disco vibes that I've never really liked. And when the songwriting didn't feel all that special, and I personally would argue that Jessie Ware's very polished delivery fit a 1970s sound a little bit better, look, I just wound up lukewarm on What's Your Pleasure as a whole. And in a year that also contained Dua Lipa's Future Nostalgia and plenty of other throwback synth-pop records, it wasn't like I was short on supply, you have to understand. So okay, fast forward to 2023, where if I'm being brutally honest, I would argue that mainstream pop is in a pretty dire state, especially if you look at the Hot 100 right now, but indie pop, kind of all over the place, but I would say slightly better than average. And with Jessie Ware getting even more critical acclaim this time around, I went in skeptical, but I really wanted to like this. Keep in mind that when I reviewed What's Your Pleasure, I had the lingering thought it would be that indie critical darling breakthrough that then promptly gets forgotten on the follow-up release, and thus far I have been very wrong in that department, so maybe this is something special? You gotta hope? Well, yes. It absolutely is. This is the sort of phenomenal pop disco album that in a just world would smash through and dominate if it had dropped in 1977 or 2023. More importantly, it highlights how not only was the last album not really a fluke, but also a full embrace of the richer strains of 1970s disco and R&B and soul that completely gets past all the textural hang-ups I previously had. Yeah, it's a throwback album to be sure, but it's the sort that doesn't feel embedded in that era. This works now, but it could have worked in plenty of other decades should they be receptive to this sound. And it's just such a tremendous relief on my part for me to say this. I finally get it. I get this album, and man, it's awesome. But alright, before we get to the big changes that really clinched it for me, let's talk about what was always really strong and gave Jessie Ware such a high floor before, her presence as a performer. Now I normally would say singer here, she's got excellent classically trained chops, but with the organic control to not really lean on that training, where she could be very soft-spoken to draw in the audience, create that subtle gravity in the room. But this album, it unlocks a layer of performative flair that caught me off guard in a great way, calling to mind some of the old disco queens like Donna Summer and especially Grace Jones in her declarative spoken passages like on Beautiful People and Shake the Bottle. Now, I would call it camp for how much more strident and flamboyant she sounds, and look, with some of the backing vocals, I can definitely see how this would spill into that territory. They definitely bring some truly ruckus energy that makes these songs so goddamn infectious, but Jessie Ware also has such command of the atmosphere on sheer charisma and vocal prowess that there's no failed seriousness going on here. You gotta buy into that scene, with Jessie Ware's intensity resounding in every romantic flair, both the dramatic and the melodramatic. And while we are in this territory, let's talk about the content. And this is where it could get a little bit ridiculous, because this is a pretty direct, straightforward album that really delivers exactly what's on the tin. Pure pleasure. That feels good. Not explicitly sexual, unless you want to be. This is where Jessie Ware's skill from working in sophistopop really shines through. This album is understated in its flirtations. She gets that the implication, the anticipation. That's where the magic can really manifest. The entreaty to join on the dance floor and, well, let's see what happens. It builds tension masterfully. It's one reason I would buck against outright calling this album horny. Now, yeah, that was sure all throughout disco, and there was absolutely nothing wrong with that, but the poetry here is more about playful freedom, new thrills. The sensuality is absolutely subtext, but doesn't really leave that territory. The closest this album gets to being outright explicit, it's probably Shake the Bottle, in describing a string of guys that she has dallied with before, which absolutely leans closest to camp with an instrumental that I'd say owes a fair bit to the Bee Gees, especially in that horn line, but she still censors any swear words. There's nothing that's openly explicit on this project, and not only does that better emulate the time period, it also proves that she doesn't really need to go there, but the option's always available. If you know, you know. Well, okay, if I'm being honest, there's also the closer Two Lips, which, well, very well could be a double entendre. That's for all of y'all to decide, especially as the song works as such a fantastic outro that's literally is about leaving someone wanting more. That being said, you could argue this makes the project a little bit one-dimensional, the same complaint that I had about What's Your Pleasure. And, well, okay, I could point to Hello Love as a reunion song on the dance floor that shows a little bit more dimension, or that Jessie Ware's delivery is loaded with implications, giving this album some subtler depths of feeling. Well, okay, yeah, I get the assessment, but I don't really agree, mostly because there is more flair in the presentation this time. Everyone sounds considerably more invested, and that in and of itself is uncharted territory for Jessie Ware. Ergo, thematically, the album becomes an argument for its own existence, and taking new chances artistically as well as on the dance floor, and the big communal vibes, especially with all the backing vocals, makes it very easy to sing along, root for its own success. Of course, the other thing that makes this album exceptionally easy to like and root for is the production, and my god, this is some of the best sounding disco I have heard in years. That's one reason I'm not inclined to call this an outright throwback, because as someone who inherited a significant number of old disco and soul records, most were pretty lush, reasonably well produced, but you could also tell where the budgets ran kind of shallow, but for the very best of them, which is not a problem with the production here, which pays a lot of tribute to Donna Summer, ABBA, Minnie Riperton, the Bee Gees, Earth, Wind & Fire, and more. But again, this is not just an album that wants to revel in the past. There's this brightness to the strings, the guitar rollicks, the bass lines, especially the saxophones and trombones and trumpets that are trying to feel more contemporary, be it from James Ford's production lending that sound palette a more burnished punch to the more synthetic touches courtesy of Stuart Price. But none of this would work at all without a great rhythm section. And this is where I think Jessie Ware shows a slightly broader knowledge of disco in cross-pollinating her sound, specifically pulling on Brazilian boogie and disco for a more textured pattern of percussion that almost ventures closer to Afrobeat at times. Now, I will say, this could trend near the whole cultural appropriation, cultural exchange conversation, but you can tell that Jessie Ware is well prepared for that by A, putting in a lot of work live and on tour with Afrobeat and jazz band Kokoroko, B, very openly professing how she is a student of these sounds and is clearly indebted to the classics, especially the sound's queer roots that manifest beautifully through the run of Beautiful People, The French House of Freak Me Now, and Shake the Bottle. And C, being really fucking great at all of this all the same. I love how the saxophone just washes through the opening title track, a sax that also does some really heavy lifting on the soulful slow burn of Hello Love, and then the terrific horn climax and breakdown on Begin Again, and just how well they splash across these lips for the epic fade out. Then there's the pianos that drive into Free Yourself and the ABBA-esque Begin Again. And then there's just so much ridiculous rollicking charm to Shake the Bottle that I found myself smiling along every single time. It's a ridiculous song, but it works. That being said, I do have two relatively minor critiques. The first being somewhat obvious, the latter less so. The first, it's lightning, widely considered a bit of an odd cut for going more towards contemporary R&B, even closer to some of Jessie Ware's older records with the pitch-shifted vocals and the fizzier groove. I still think the song is really good, but it might snap you out of the sheer magic of this album, and it does feel kind of out of place, even if a slowdown is the correct choice for the penultimate track. But my second critique, it actually comes with some of Stuart Price's production. Don't get me wrong, I think his choices in the buzzier synths and the slightly sharper guitar lines do a lot to help this album fit in alongside new disco and feel modern, differentiate the song so it doesn't all run together, especially on Pearls and Free Yourself, even if I'm slightly cooler on the choice to move towards stiffer 80s inspired tones. But he also handled the mixing of those two, plus Freak Me Now, and he places Jessie Ware's vocals a bit too far into the mix, especially when Pearls has her really show off her range and the impact feels a bit more muted than it should. Yes, I'm absolutely nitpicking, but when you have an album this gorgeous, I am gonna notice those moments that pull you out of it, and there are a few. That being said, That Feels Good is fantastic. Absolutely deserves all the critical acclaim that it's getting for once. It became very clear that What's Your Pleasure was a transition to come to this, a much tighter, refined, and focused album that simultaneously goes for broke more often and hits way more home runs. With the restraint, this album erupts way more effectively. It kind of fits in similar territory to Silk Sonic for me. Definitely has those throwback elements, but showcases a broader knowledge of the sound, and she can pull together enough distinctive personality for it to feel modern and contemporary. It absolutely shines as a result. This is handily one of the best of 2023, one of my biggest pleasant surprises of the year. So yeah, hit the dance floor with this. It'll feel good. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. Yeah, I was thrilled with this album. It kind of came out of nowhere for me. I was not expecting a Jessie Ware album to work for me, especially as I was lukewarm on What's Your Pleasure, but yeah, this is special. I had so much fun with this. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get albums on my schedule for future reviews in any particular way, link to my Patreon right over there. You help support the channel beyond my merch below. You can argue with me on my Discord, or help get albums on my schedule. Once again, don't feel obligated. Tough times, I understand, but options available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.